Hello, young soul. Welcome to the Daily Horror Channel. If you are afraid of real and scary reports, this channel is not for you. I suggest you leave this video, but if you are not afraid of listening to these horrifying reports, I suggest you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Fazenda Santa Clara was a forgotten jewel amidst the vast rural lands of São Miguel, a place where time seemed to stand still. The once vibrant property was now shrouded in a blanket of silence and abandonment, with whispered stories of unexplained events and hauntings. Maria, a young heiress of the property, decided to move to the farm after the death of her grandmother, Dona Clara, to restart her life and perhaps uncover the secrets that the farm held. When I received the news of my grandmother Clara's death, I was overcome by a mixture of sadness and curiosity. Since I was little, I had heard stories about the Santa Clara farm, but I had never visited the place. My name is Maria, and I decided it was time to discover the secrets that my grandmother had left behind and start my life over on her land. I arrived at the farm on a sunny late afternoon, but the place did not reflect the beauty of the sky. The big house was in ruins, with broken windows and walls covered in moss. The surrounding trees looked like shadowy shadows against the twilight. The wind was cold, and a feeling of oppression seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The first night on the farm was unsettling. As I walked through the dark hallways, I felt a constant presence, as if I was being watched. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and the house seemed to whisper ancient secrets. I decided to explore my grandmother's belongings, hoping to find answers to what I was feeling. In the attic, I found an old trunk covered in dust. Inside were diaries, letters, and a violin that seemed to have been very important to my grandmother. The first pages of the diaries talked about life on the farm, but soon the accounts turned dark. Clara wrote about visions of shadowy figures in the fields, whispers at night, and a constant feeling of being watched. "There's something wrong here," read one of the entries. "I hear voices. I see shadows that shouldn't be there. I feel like the farm is haunted by the souls of those who suffered here." Reading the diaries, I discovered that the farm had been built on an old quilombo, where escaped slaves sought refuge. My grandmother mentioned ancient rituals performed to protect the land, but she also spoke of a curse cast by a matriarch to keep the property safe, but at a terrible cost. As I delved into my grandmother's memories, I began to hear a soft, haunting melody. The sound came from the violin. I picked up the instrument, and a cold feeling ran through my body. The melody seemed to guide me through the corridors, taking me to the basement. The basement was cold and damp, with stone walls that seemed to close in around me. At the back of the room, I found an altar covered in strange symbols, and the sound of the violin became more intense. I felt a presence next to me, and when I looked, I saw the figure of a woman with empty eyes and a pained expression. "My grandmother, Maria, you must undo the curse," she said, her voice echoing off the pedestrian walls. "Those who suffer here need peace. You are the only one who can help them." With the help of the diaries, I began to recite the words of the ritual, but the evil presence around me became stronger. The shadows stirred, and the whispers turned to screams of despair. My grandmother's figure disappeared, leaving me alone with the forces that haunted the farm. At the climax of the ritual, the light from the candles around the altar exploded into a blinding glow, and I felt a surge of energy course through my body. The shadows began to dissipate and the screams ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. I felt like I had managed to banish part of the curse, but I knew I wasn't completely free. In the days that followed, the farm felt lighter, but there was still a sense of restlessness. I continued my research, determined to find a way to completely free the souls trapped on the property. I discovered that the violin was the key, an artifact used in ancient rituals that needed to be purified. I decided to take the violin to an old friend of my grandmother, Mr. Amaral, an expert in ancient rituals and legends. He confirmed my suspicions. The violin needed to be purified in a special ceremony in the heart of the farm, where the original Quilombo was located. With Pedro by my side, I returned to the farm to perform the ritual. The weather worsened as we approached the site, with dark clouds covering the sky and thunder echoing in the distance. Upon arriving at the heart of the farm, we began to prepare the ritual, lighting candles around the violin and reciting the ancient words. The shadows around us began to stir again, and the evil presence became more intense. The figure of my grandmother appeared, this time accompanied by other souls trapped on the farm. "Carry on, Maria," she said. "We are almost there." At the climax of the ritual, the candlelight intensified once more, and a burst of energy swept through the room. The shadows were completely dispelled, and I felt a deep peace fill the farm. Souls, including my grandmother's, began to disappear, freed from their prison. The violin, now purified, gave one last gentle melody before falling completely silent. I felt a tear run down my face, knowing that I had managed to free those who suffered on the farm. The Santa Clara farm was finally at peace, but the feeling that something was still lurking in the shadows never completely disappeared. The fight against evil may be over for now, but he knew constant vigilance was necessary. My journey may have found a moment of peace, but the echo of the violin melody still resonated in my memories, a constant reminder of what I had faced and what I could face again. And so, with a promise to continue protecting the legacy of my grandmother and those who suffered on the farm, I left the Santa Clara farm, knowing that I will always be ready to face any challenge the future may bring. The fight against evil is eternal, and as long as there is courage and determination, light will always prevail over darkness. But the feeling that something more terrible was yet to come kept me vigilant. And my story, like the farm, remained open, waiting for the next chapter. Upon returning to my home in the city, I thought I would be able to leave the events at Fazenda Santa Clara behind. However, the nightmares persisted. Sleepless nights, tormented by images of shadows and whispers, made me begin to doubt whether I had really finished what I started on the farm. One day I received an unexpected call from Mr. Amaral. He had an urgent, worried voice. "Maria, we need to talk. There's something I discovered about the violin. Meet me at the Vila do Porto library tomorrow." I took the first bus to Vila do Porto, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. Upon arriving, I found Mr. Amaral surrounded by old books and documents spread across the table. He explained to me that after our last conversation, he continued researching the curse in the violin. I discovered that the violin was not just an artifact used in rituals. He began. "He's a conduit, a channel for something much older and more powerful than we imagined. And I believe that the ritual we performed on the farm was not enough to completely seal this entity." My heart sank upon hearing his words. The relief I felt on the farm had been only temporary. "What we need to do?" I asked, my voice shaking. "There is a second ritual, older and more powerful," he said. "But to accomplish it, we need to return to the farm and use the violin in a ceremony during the winter solstice. Only then can we seal this entity away forever." Winter was just a few weeks away. Time was short, and fear began to set in again. However, I knew I had no choice. I needed to face this darkness once again, for the sake of those still trapped in that curse and for the peace of my own mind. I returned to the farm, accompanied by Mr. Amaral and Pedro, who refused to let me face this alone. The farm was different. The air was colder, and a thick fog enveloped the property, giving a feeling of isolation and imminent danger. The shadows seemed to move faster, and the whispers were louder and more insistent. We prepared for the ritual, aware that it would be a long and dangerous night. Mr. Amaral explained the detailed steps, and each of us had a crucial role to play. When solstice night arrived, we were ready, but the fear and anxiety were palpable. In the heart of the farm, where the original Quilombo had been built, we began the ritual. The violin emitted a haunting melody, and the evil presence he had felt before became overwhelming. The shadows around us began to materialize into dark, distorted figures. "You won't make it," a guttural voice echoed, the same entity he had faced before. The shadow figures advanced, trying to interrupt us. Pedro and I held sacred candles, while Mr. Amaral recited the ancient words of the ritual. With each verse recited, the resistance of the shadows increased. They tried to push us away, but we remained firm, fighting the terror that enveloped us. The violin's melody became a battle between light and darkness, a seemingly endless clash of forces. At the ritual's climax, the violin let out a piercing scream, and the candlelight intensified, driving the shadows and the entity away. The air crackled with energy, and a wave of heat swept through the room. The shadow figures disappeared, and the farm was enveloped in a deep silence. I fell to my knees, exhausted but relieved. I felt that the entity had finally been sealed, but at a high cost. Mr. Amaral was pale and weak, and Pedro helped me to my feet. We knew we had succeeded, but the peace seemed temporary, a fragile interlude between battles. We returned to the farmhouse where we reflected on what we had done. The violin, now a simple instrument unburdened by the souls trapped within, rested on a table. The shadows had disappeared and the sense of oppression had given way to an air of serenity. Yet the feeling that something more was yet to come never left me. The Santa Clara farm was at peace for now, but the battle against evil was eternal. I knew that I would always be ready to face whatever challenge the future might bring. And so my story continues, with the promise of protecting the legacy of my grandmother and those who suffered on the farm. The light may have prevailed this time, but darkness always finds a way to return. The fight against evil is endless, and as long as there is courage and determination, light will always prevail over darkness. But the feeling that something more terrible was yet to come kept me vigilant. And my story, like the farm, remained open, waiting for the next chapter. As we reflected on the apparent peace on the farm, an unsettling feeling began to settle over me. The silence, which had initially seemed like a relief, began to feel artificial, as if it were covering up something darker. That night, Pedro, Mr. Amaral, and I decided to spend our last night at the big house before returning to the city. As night fell, a storm began to gather on the horizon. Lightning lit up the sky and thunder rumbled across the property, creating an even more ominous atmosphere. The violin, now silent, remained on the table in the living room, a constant reminder of the horrors we had endured. As we prepared for bed, a low, deep sound began to reverberate through the house. It sounded like a chant, a dark lament that spread to every corner of the house. I got up from the bed, trying to locate the source of the sound. Pedro and Mr. Amaral were also standing, their faces pale and eyes wide. The sound seemed to be emanating from the basement. We descended together, each step increasing the tension in our bodies. When we reached the basement, we saw something that chilled us. The violin was floating in the air, emitting the haunting melody of its own accord. The candles around the altar lit up spontaneously, and the shadows began to move again. "Maria, it is not finished," my grandmother's voice whispered, echoing through the basement. "You must complete the entire ritual." Suddenly, a portal of shadows opened before us, revealing a dark, pulsating abyss. I understood that the ritual we had performed was only part of the process, and the true challenge lay ahead of us. Pedro, Mr. Amaral, and I joined together, determined to face whatever lay beyond that portal. As we stepped through, we were swallowed by an oppressive darkness. The sensation of cold was intense, and the whispers became deafening. We were on a different plane, a place where the evil entity had complete dominion. In the center of this shadowy realm, we saw the entity's true form, a colossal figure of shadows and pain, with eyes that glowed like embers. "Do you dare challenge me in my own domain?" Its voice echoed, reverberating in our souls. With the violin in my hands, I began to play the melody of the final ritual. The music, initially fragile, gained strength and light, cutting through the darkness around us. Pedro and Mr. Amaral recited the ancient words, their voices firm and resolute. The entity advanced, trying to crush us with its overwhelming presence. but the music and the words of the ritual created a barrier of light around us. The battle was intense, with the entity trying to break through our defenses. But we continued, determined to win. At the climax of the ritual, the light from the violin became blinding, and the entity let out a final scream of agony. The darkness began to dissipate, and the portal of shadows closed with a bang. We were thrown back into the cellar of the farm, exhausted but victorious. The violin fell to the floor, shattering into pieces, and the candles went out. We felt a wave of peace and tranquility fill the environment. The entity had finally been banished, and the Santa Clara farm was free of its curse. The next day at dawn, a feeling of renewal hovered over the farm. The shadows disappeared, and oppression gave way to a sense of freedom. We thanked Mr. Amaral for his help and said goodbye to the farm, knowing that peace had been restored. As we left the farm, one last soft melody echoed through the air, a final goodbye to my grandmother and the souls that now rested in peace. We knew the darkness might try to return, but we were prepared. The light would always prevail. And so, my story continues, with a promise to protect the legacy of my grandmother and those who suffered on the farm. The fight against evil is eternal, and as long as there is courage and determination, light will always prevail over darkness. And the Santa Clara farm, now at peace, awaited the next chapter of its history, ready to face any challenge that the future might bring. Deep in the wild mountains of the Spirit Range, a temple that had been forgotten for centuries was hidden. It was said to be the home of an ancient and powerful entity, worshipped as a god by the ancestors who lived there. Many archaeologists and explorers have disappeared trying to unravel its secrets. Dr. Henry, a renowned and skeptical archaeologist determined to prove the truth of the legends told by his grandfather, leads an expedition to find and explore the temple. However, he is unprepared for the horrors that await in the darkness. My name is Henry, and since I was a child, I have been fascinated by the stories my grandfather told of ancient temples and lost civilizations. He spoke passionately of a temple in the mountains of the Spirit Range, a place that, he said, held powerful and dangerous secrets. As an archaeologist, I have always sought scientific evidence for these legends, and now I am determined to find the temple and prove the truth of my grandfather's stories. The journey to the Spirit Range was arduous. My team and I braved steep trails and harsh weather conditions. The air was cold and thin, and the feeling of oppression grew as we approached the location depicted on the ancient maps. Finally, after days of walking, we spotted the entrance to the temple. It was a monumental structure carved into the face of the mountain, covered in moss and vegetation. As we entered the temple, a chill ran down my spine. The air inside was heavy, almost suffocating, and a deep darkness enveloped us. We turned on our flashlights and set out, exploring the narrow corridors and vast chambers. The walls were covered in inscriptions and symbols that I had never seen before, but which felt inexplicably familiar. During our initial exploration, we heard unexplained noises, footsteps that were not ours, incomprehensible whispers, and shadows moving at the edges of our vision. My team was visibly nervous, and I tried to remain calm, even though my heart was racing. Deep inside me, something told me that we were not alone. I found a larger chamber with an altar in the center. On it sat an ancient, dusty, but well-preserved violin. It seemed out of place amidst the stone and metal relics. As I played the violin, a soft, melancholy melody filled the air. I felt the presence of something ancient and powerful, as if the violin itself were a channel for the entity that inhabited the temple. The inscriptions on the walls around the altar told a disturbing story. They spoke of an ancient ritual performed to protect the temple from invaders, but which ended up sealing an evil entity within its walls. This entity was worshipped by the ancestors but also feared. The violin was used in the rituals to keep the entity asleep, but if it was played incorrectly, it could awaken it. As I read the inscriptions, I felt an icy touch on my shoulder. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. My colleagues, Pedro and Luisa, were on the other side of the chamber, examining other inscriptions. "Enrique, are you okay?" Peter asked, sensing my uneasiness. I nodded, trying to hide my fear, but I knew something was wrong. That night, we decided to camp inside the temple. It was risky, but we felt it was safer than going back outside into the darkness of the mountains. We pitched our tents in the main chamber next to the altar. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional sound of water drops falling from the stalactites in the ceiling. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of the violin playing by itself. The melody was haunting, filling the temple with an atmosphere of fear and despair. I got up and followed the sound, finding the violin floating above the altar, enveloped in a ghostly light. The shadows around the altar stirred, forming indistinct figures that seemed to move and watch. "Henry, you must finish what you started," whispered a familiar voice. It was my grandfather's voice, but he had been dead for years. I felt a chill run through my body. The shadowy figures began to approach, and I backed away, tripping over a rock and falling to the ground. Pedro and Luisa came running, awakened by my screams. "What's happening?" Luisa asked, her eyes wide with fear. I pointed to the violin still floating and explained what I had seen and heard. We decided that we needed to continue exploring the temple and find a way to seal the entity once and for all. The following days were marked by disturbing events. Objects moved on their own, whispers filled the air, and shadows seemed to have a life of their own. Every step we took into the temple increased the feeling of oppression. We discovered more inscriptions that detailed the complete ritual needed to banish the entity. We needed to perform the ritual at the main altar, using the violin, during the next lunar eclipse, which would occur in just 2 days. The night of the eclipse arrived, and we were prepared to face whatever came. We set up the altar, lit the sacred candles, and began to recite the ancient words. Pedro played the violin, while Luisa and I recited the ritual. The shadows around us became more intense, and the evil presence began to manifest itself physically. A colossal figure of shadows and pain emerged from the altar, eyes glowing like embers. "You cannot stop me," growled the entity, voice reverberating off the temple walls. The atmosphere was one of pure terror, and we felt the strength of the entity trying to separate us and break our concentration. I continued reciting the ritual, my voice shaking but steady. Pedro played the violin with more intensity, and the melody became a battle of light against darkness. The entity advanced, trying to crush us with its overwhelming presence. But the barrier of light created by the melody and words of the ritual began to weaken it. At the climax of the ritual, a blinding explosion of light coursed through the temple, dispelling the shadows and the entity in a final scream of agony. The violin fell to the floor, breaking into pieces, and the candlelight went out, leaving us in a deep, peaceful silence. We fell to our knees, exhausted but victorious. We felt that the entity had finally been banished, and the temple was free of its curse. The feeling of oppression disappeared, replaced by a renewed tranquility. As we left the temple, the dawn light began to appear on the horizon. We felt that we had managed to free the temple from its darkness, but the feeling that something more terrible might still be coming never completely left us. We left the Cordillera dos Espíritus with a mixture of relief and concern. We knew that although we had won this battle, the fight against evil is eternal. My journey as an archaeologist was far from over, and the promise to continue protecting the secrets of the past remained firm. And so, our story continues, with the certainty that light will always prevail over darkness, as long as there is courage and determination. The Spirit Mountain Range held many dark secrets, and our constant vigilance was necessary to face any challenges the future might bring. After returning from the Spirit Mountain Range, I tried to resume my normal life. but something inside me had changed. Memories of the events at the temple were vivid and disturbing. I felt restless, as if something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to manifest itself. Pedro, Luisa, and I kept in constant contact. We shared the same sense of restlessness and fear, as if the entity we banished had not been completely destroyed, but merely dormant. We began to study ancient legends and rituals deeper, trying to find any clue that could give us a sense of security. One night, while reviewing my field diaries and research notes, I received an unexpected call from Luisa. Her voice was shaking. "Enrique, you need to come here. I found something in my grandfather's notes that could change everything." I took the first flight to the city where Luisa lived. Upon arrival, she greeted me with a serious expression. "You won't believe what I found," she said, leading me into her living room. There, on the table, were scattered ancient documents and a map that appeared to detail a series of connected temples, all located in different parts of the world. According to these notes, the temple we visited is just one of many. They are all interconnected by an ancient ritual of protection and sealing, explained Luisa. If we don't reinforce these seals, the entity may find a way to return. My mind reeled with the implications. So do we need to visit these temples and perform the rituals in each of them? Yes, she replied, and time is against us. Each temple has a specific window during the year in which the ritual can be performed. We need to hurry. Pedro joined us the next day, and we began planning our new expedition. Our first destination was a remote island in the Pacific where the next temple was located. The journey was long and tiring, but we knew we had no choice. Upon arriving on the island, we were greeted by a small, isolated village. The locals seemed suspicious, but an elderly woman named Aunt Moana approached us. "You came because of the temple, didn't you?" she asked, her eyes full of wisdom and concern. We explained our mission, and she nodded. "The temple is ancient and powerful. Many have tried, but few have succeeded. I will take you there, but know that the danger is great." We followed Aunt Moana along a winding path that led us to the heart of the island. The temple was different from the previous one, but equally impressive and intimidating. As we entered, the feeling of oppression and darkness enveloped us again. We prepared the altar and lit the sacred candles, as we had done before. Pedro began to play the melody on the violin, and Luisa and I recited the words of the ritual. The shadows began to stir, and whispers filled the air. The evil presence was there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Suddenly, the walls of the temple began to tremble, and a colossal figure of shadows and pain emerged from the altar, like the entity we had faced in the Spirit Mountains. "You cannot stop me," roared the guttural voice, reverberating through the temple. The battle that followed was intense. The entity attacked with greater force this time, determined to destroy us. The shadows tried to separate us, but we maintained our concentration, strengthened by our previous experience. The violin's melody became a barrier of light, and the words of the ritual created a protective shield around us. The climax of the ritual brought a burst of light that dissipated the shadows and the entity in a final scream of agony. The violin fell to the floor, shattering into pieces, and the candlelight went out, leaving us in a deep, peaceful silence. Once more we fell to our knees, exhausted but victorious. We knew we had successfully banished the entity from this temple, but the feeling that something more terrible was yet to come never completely left us. As we left the temple, Aunt Moana waited for us with a sympathetic look. "You have done well, but the journey is far from over," she said. "There are other temples, other battles to be fought." The light of dawn began to break on the horizon, and we felt that we had succeeded in freeing yet another temple from its darkness. But the fight against evil is eternal, and our journey as guardians of the temples was only just beginning. We knew that we would need courage and determination to face whatever lay ahead. We left the island with a mixture of relief and trepidation. We knew that, although we had won this battle, the fight against evil is never ending. And so our story continues, with the promise of protecting the secrets of the temples and those who suffered in their name. The journey to protect the temples and the world was only just beginning, and each step brought us closer to the unknown. The fight against the darkness required constant vigilance, and we were ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. Light will always prevail over darkness, as long as there is courage and determination. And so our story continues, awaiting the next chapter in our eternal battle against the forces of evil. We continue our journey, each temple presenting a new challenge, and each ritual a battle between light and darkness. With each victory, we felt the entity retreat, but its presence never completely disappeared. Our determination grew, but so did our exhaustion. Our final destination took us to the heart of the Amazon, where the largest and oldest of the temples was hidden. We reached the edge of a wide, dark river, where a local guide, known only as a Naru, awaited us. "The temple is beyond the river," he said, his eyes serious. "Few return from there." As we crossed the river, the feeling of oppression grew. The forest around us seemed alive, the shadows moving as if watching us. Finally, we saw the entrance to the temple, a monumental structure covered in vines and moss, emanating an aura of power and danger. As we entered, darkness seemed to envelop us immediately. The air was heavy and suffocating, and the walls were covered in ancient inscriptions that spoke of rituals and sacrifices. We prepared ourselves for the final ritual, knowing that this would be our last chance to seal the entity away forever. We set up the altar, lit the sacred candles, and Pedro began to play the melody on his violin. Luisa and I recited the words of the ritual, our voices echoing through the dark chambers of the temple. The shadows began to stir violently, and an overwhelming presence filled the room. The entity emerged from the altar larger and more powerful than ever. "You cannot stop me," it roared, its voice reverberating off the walls of the temple. The air turned cold, and a sense of despair tried to envelop us. But we maintained our concentration, focused on the melody and the words of the ritual. The entity attacked with renewed fury, trying to break through our light barrier. The shadows around us became almost palpable, pressing down on us from all sides. We felt the force of the entity trying to separate us, but our determination was unshakable. We continued the ritual, each word and note of music weakening the entity. At the climax of the ritual, a blinding explosion of light coursed through the temple, dispelling the shadows and the entity in a final scream of agony. The violin gave one last soft melody before breaking into pieces, and the candlelight went out, leaving us in a deep, peaceful silence. We fell to our knees, exhausted but victorious. We felt that the entity had finally been banished, and the temple was free of its curse. The feeling of oppression disappeared, replaced by a renewed tranquility. As we left the temple, Anaru was waiting for us with an understanding look. "You did well," he said. "The world is in your debt." The sun began to rise, bathing the forest in golden light. We felt that we had managed to free the last temple from its darkness, and the feeling of relief was immense. We knew that the fight against evil was eternal, but we also knew that the light would always prevail. We returned to our lives with the certainty that we had accomplished our mission. The temples were safe and the world was a little more protected from the forces of darkness. But the feeling that something more terrible could still be coming has never completely left us. And so, our story continues, with a promise to protect the legacy of the temples and those who suffered in their name. The light may have prevailed this time, but the darkness never rests. The fight against evil is infinite, and as long as there is courage and determination, the light will always prevail. And so we end our journey, knowing that the next chapter of our story is yet to be written. The island of Alvarado was a place shrouded in mystery and dark stories. Located miles offshore, it was known for its lighthouse, an ancient monolith that had long guided ships through the region's treacherous waters. The nearest city, Vila do Porto, had few people who dared to talk about the island, and even fewer who dared to visit. Helena, a talented maritime historian, decided to face the fears and rumors to discover the hidden truth about the lighthouse and the missing lighthouse keeper. My name is Helena, and I have always been fascinated by historical mysteries. Working as a maritime historian, I have dedicated my life to uncovering secrets of the seas and their lost stories. The island of Alvarado was an enigma that I could not ignore. Stories of disappearances, supernatural sightings, and a lighthouse keeper who mysteriously disappeared more than a century ago were enough to draw me to that isolated place. Upon arriving in Vila do Porto, I felt a chill down my spine. The freezing wind and waves crashing on the rocks created an oppressive atmosphere. The village's inhabitants were reserved, and few were willing to talk about the island. I did, however, manage to hire a small boat and a reluctant guide called Pedro, who agreed to take me to Alvarado. The trip to the island was marked by tense silence. Pedro, with his worried look, just warned me, "Be careful with what you might find. Some stories are best left in the past." We crossed the murky waters to the island, where the lighthouse stood imposingly against the gray sky. The first impression of the island was bleak: dense vegetation, worn trails, and a feeling of abandonment. The lighthouse, with its sturdy structure and dusty windows, seemed like a silent guardian of dark secrets. I entered the lighthouse with a mixture of excitement and apprehension, eager to discover what was hidden there. As I explored the interior of the lighthouse, I realized that the rumors were not just stories. Old objects were scattered everywhere: record books, diaries yellowed with age, and rusty tools. I began reading the records, discovering the life of the lighthouse keeper, a man named Arthur, who seemed dedicated to his work, but whose last notes showed signs of growing fear. "Something is wrong here," wrote Arthur. "I hear whispers in the night. Shadows move across the walls, and I feel a presence that constantly watches me." Each diary entry revealed a gradual deterioration of his sanity. The whispers and shadows he mentioned began to haunt me too. I felt like I wasn't alone, even when silence reigned. On the first night, I stayed in the room that had a direct view of the sea. The full moon illuminated the lighthouse, casting strange shadows across the walls. As I tried to sleep, I heard a low, almost imperceptible sound as if someone was playing a distant violin. I got out of bed and went to investigate, following the sound to the lighthouse's main room. The violin was on a table, intact and covered in dust. When I played the violin, a dark melody filled the room. I felt a presence behind me and quickly turned around, but there was no one. The air grew cold, and the whispers began. "Helena, help me." The voice sounded like someone in deep despair. I put the violin aside, trying to control my growing fear. I decided I needed to find out more about Arthur and what really happened to him. Over the next few days, I continued my research, exploring every corner of the lighthouse and the island. I discovered an old altar hidden in the basement of the lighthouse, with symbols I didn't recognize. Upon investigating further, I found a book of ancient rituals, full of notes, and notes made by Arthur. He believed the lighthouse was haunted by an evil entity that he accidentally summoned during a ritual to protect the lighthouse. As the night progressed, the supernatural events intensified. The shadows moved more frequently, the whispers became louder, and the feeling of being watched was constant. The weather worsened, with sudden storms and howling winds shaking the walls of the lighthouse. I began to doubt my own sanity, but I knew I needed to keep going. One night, while reading Arthur's diary, I heard a scream coming from the basement. I ran downstairs, finding the altar covered in fresh blood and the violin playing alone. Arthur's shadowy figure appeared, his eyes empty and his expression pained. "You must finish what I started," he said, his voice distorted with grief. I tried to talk to him, but the figure disappeared, leaving me alone in the basement. I felt an invisible force push me towards the altar, and the ritual book fell open to a specific page. I realized that Arthur wanted me to complete the ritual to banish the entity once and for all. With shaking hands, I began to recite the words of the ritual, feeling the evil presence intensify around me. As he recited the ritual, the shadows began to shake violently, and Arthur's figure reappeared, screaming in pain and rage. The evil entity tried to stop me, but I continued, determined to free the island from the curse. The light from the lighthouse began to shine brightly, and a wave of energy swept through the room, dispelling the shadows and Arthur's figure. When I finished the ritual, I fell to my knees, exhausted and in shock. The oppressive presence disappeared and the lighthouse fell silent. I knew I had managed to banish the entity, but the price was high. Peace returned to the island, but the feeling that something still lurked in the shadows never completely disappeared. I returned to Vila do Porto. Taking with me Arthur's records and the book of rituals, I thanked Pedro for his help and decided it was time to share my story with the world. However, I still hear the violin melody on the quietest nights, a constant reminder of what I faced on the island of Alvarado. The fight against evil never ends, and the feeling that something more terrible is yet to come keeps me vigilant. The island of Alvarado may be at peace for now, but I know the darkness always finds a way to return. My story continues, with the promise that I will be ready to face the next challenge, always vigilant, always courageous. And so, my journey does not end here. The lighthouse and the island of Alvarado hold many dark secrets, and the feeling that my battle against the darkness is far from over remains. Evil may have been temporarily banished, but as long as there is courage and determination, there will always be hope to face the darkness that lurks. After returning to Vila do Porto, I spent weeks reviewing the records and documents I brought from the island. Every page of Arthur's diary, every symbol and entry in the ritual book seemed to reveal more layers of mystery and darkness. But something continued to haunt me. The feeling that the entity we banished was not completely destroyed, just dormant, waiting for a new opportunity to free itself. The nights in Vila do Porto were unsettling. The distant sound of the violin seemed to follow me, echoing in my dreams and turning them into nightmares. I decided that I couldn't leave the situation like this. I needed to ensure that the entity was banned once and for all. I met with Pedro again, who, although reluctant, agreed to help me again. He also seemed to feel that something was still wrong. "Helena, I feel like the island is still in danger," said Pedro. "We must discover the full truth and ensure this curse never returns." Before returning to the island, we visited a local historian, Mr. Amaral, who had in-depth knowledge about legends and ancient stories of the region. He told us about an artifact, a lost amulet that supposedly had the power to permanently seal away evil entities. According to him, the amulet was hidden in a secret cave on the island of Alvarado itself. Armed with this new information, Pedro and I prepared for another journey to the island. We crossed the dark, choppy waters, feeling the tension increase with each mile. Arriving at the island, the atmosphere seemed even more oppressive than before, as if the land itself was aware of our presence and disliked it. We began exploring the island in search of the cave mentioned by Mr. Amaral. The dense vegetation and almost impassable trails made our search difficult and frightening. As we walked, shadows seemed to follow us. Whispers floated on the wind, and the feeling of being watched never left us. After hours of searching, we finally found the entrance to the cave hidden behind a waterfall. The interior was cold and damp, with walls covered in moss and ancient symbols carved into the cave. The darkness inside the cave was almost total, but we continued, guided by our flashlights and the determination to find the amulet. Deep in the cave, we found a small stone altar where the amulet rested, enveloped in an aura of dim light. I took the amulet carefully, feeling a wave of energy course through my body. The moment we touched the amulet, the cave began to shake, and a dark presence emerged from the shadows. It was the entity, more powerful and furious than ever. Pedro and I prepared ourselves to face what came next. The entity manifested as a figure of pure darkness, eyes glowing with malice. "You can't stop me," he growled, his voice echoing in the depths of the cave. "This island is mine, and you will pay for your insolence." The air around us turned freezing, and the feeling of despair began to set in. But holding the amulet, I felt a new strength within me. I knew this was the decisive moment. With Pedro by my side, I began to recite the words of the ritual that Arthur had begun, but this time, with the added power of the amulet. The light from the amulet intensified, illuminating the cave and forcing the entity to retreat. The shadows around us began to dissipate, and the entity's scream of rage was replaced by one of pain and despair. I continued reciting the ritual, feeling the evil presence weaken. At the ritual's climax, the amulet's light exploded into a blinding brilliance, and the entity let out a final scream before disappearing completely. The cave became silent, and the feeling of oppression disappeared. We knew we had managed to banish the entity once and for all. We returned to the lighthouse for one last inspection. The place felt different, lighter, free from the darkness that had enveloped it for so long. Pedro and I said goodbye to the island, feeling that we had finally found peace. But as we walked away, an unsettling feeling still lingered in me. Even with the entity banished, something inside me knew that evil could always find a new form. Alvarado Island was safe for now, but constant vigilance was necessary. My journey may have ended here, but the echo of the midnight melody still resonated in my memories, a reminder that the battle against the darkness never truly ends. And so, with the amulet safe and the promise to continue protecting Arthur's legacy, I left the island, knowing that I will always be ready to face any challenge the future may bring. The fight against evil is eternal, and as long as there is courage and determination, light will always prevail over darkness.